The ones who should have died first. The Vocari had a word for species like humanity, drevaal. It didn't translate perfectly into any human language, but the closest meaning was something between temporary and already gone. It was the word they used for civilizations that showed up to the galactic stage with fire in their eyes and collapsed within 3 centuries. Species that burned bright and vanished, leaving nothing behind but broken satellites and silence. When the Vocari first intercepted human radio signals, chaotic, overlapping, screaming with noise and music and argument, their xenolinguists spent 14 years cataloging the transmissions before submitting a report to the High Conclave. The report was 700 pages. Its conclusion was a single sentence. This species will not survive contact with the wider galaxy. And no one argued. The Vocari were not cruel beings. They were tall, slow-moving creatures with 6-chambered hearts that beat once every 4 seconds. They had been traveling between stars for 11,000 years. They had seen 41 species rise from their home worlds and reach toward the dark. 37 of those species were gone now. The math was simply the math. So when humanity finally cracked faster-than-light travel in the year 2219, messily, dangerously, using a method that Vocari physicists winced, the Conclave didn't send warships, they sent observers. One of those observers was a Vocari diplomat named Sorveth Khan, who had spent 60 years studying human behavior through intercepted transmissions. He was considered the foremost expert on humanity in the known galaxy. He had watched humans wage wars and then rebuild the cities they'd destroyed. He had watched them poison their oceans and then spend generations trying to clean them. He had watched them bury their dead with flowers. That last part had confused him deeply. Sorveth arrived in human space aboard the Conclave vessel called the Measured Step. It was a name chosen intentionally. The Vocari believed in patience, in careful movement, in never rushing toward anything. The ship was elegant and slow, a silver needle crossing the void between stars with quiet dignity. The human ship that came to meet them looked like someone had bolted 3 different vessels together during a fuel shortage and decided it was fine. Sorveth studied it through the observation deck's viewport for a long time. The ship, designated IGV Resolute in human records, was asymmetrical. It had clearly been repaired multiple times with incompatible components. One of its engine housings was a different color than the rest of the hull, suggesting it had been replaced recently, probably after a failure. There were markings along its side that Sorveth's translation software identified as a combination of an official registry number and what appeared to be a hand-painted image of a bear. He was not sure what a bear had to do with interstellar diplomacy. The human crew hailed them 17 minutes before the scheduled communication window. Sorveth noted this. Vocari protocol demanded punctuality down to the second. Arriving early was considered a sign of anxiety, of poor emotional regulation. The face that appeared on the communication screen was a human woman with dark eyes and short silver hair. She wore a uniform that was mostly regulation issue, except for a small metal pin on her collar that Sorveth's cultural database identified as a religious symbol. She was smiling. Humans smiled constantly. It still unnerved him. Ambassador Khan, I'm Commander Yiva Drossian of the Resolute. Welcome to human space. We've been looking forward to this. As have we, Sorveth replied through the translator. We bring greetings from the Vocari High Conclave and from all 16 member species of the Galactic Assembly. 16, Yiva said, and something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, not quite sadness.
We'd heard it used to be more. Sorveth paused. Yes, it did. She held his gaze for a moment, and he had the unsettling sensation that she understood exactly what he wasn't saying. "We'll escort you to Meridian Station. Fair warning, it's a bit of a work in progress. We only finished the outer ring last year." Sorveth looked at the sensor data his ship's systems had already gathered on Meridian Station. It was large, far larger than it should have been for a species only 4 years into deep space infrastructure. The structural analysis alone showed 17 distinct construction phases, each slightly different from the last, as if the humans had been learning as they built, correcting mistakes in real time and pressing forward anyway. It was, by Vokhari standards, an absolute mess. It was also, by any standard, a breathtaking achievement. "We look forward to seeing it," he said carefully. What Sorveth didn't say, what he couldn't say yet, was that the sensor data had already flagged something unexpected, something his 60 years of studying humanity had not prepared him for. Meridian Station's power output was wrong. Not wrong in a failing sense, wrong in the sense that it was producing 3 times more energy than its visible infrastructure should have allowed. The mathematics didn't work. Whatever humanity had built at the center of that station, it wasn't anything the Conclave had seen before. The measured step followed the resolute through the dark, and Sorveth sat very still in his chair, his 6-chambered heart beating its slow and steady rhythm, and wondered, for the first time in 60 years of certainty, if perhaps the Conclave had made a mistake.
What they built in the dark. Meridian Station hung in the shadow of a gas giant humanity had named Castor 9, a churning violet world that served as both gravitational anchor and, as Sorveth would soon learn, power source. The station was built in rings. The outer rings were obvious: docking infrastructure, habitat modules, the familiar geometry of a civilization learning to live in space. But as the measured step moved closer and Sorveth's instruments reached deeper, the inner structure became stranger, denser. The sensor returns grew muddled in ways they shouldn't have, as if something at the station's core was bending the data before it could be read clearly. The Vokhari had a word for this too: verath soul. Roughly, the silence a thing makes when it doesn't want to be understood. Sorveth filed the observation and said nothing to his crew. Commander Yiva met them personally at the docking umbilical. She had brought 3 others with her. A tall man with patient eyes who was introduced to Dr. Fenris Okabu, the station's chief engineer. A younger woman named Lyra Tash who held a data tablet and said nothing but watched everything. And an older man in civilian clothes who was simply introduced as Petrov, with no title or rank offered. Sorveth had been a diplomat long enough to know that the most important person in any room was often the one with no title. He greeted them all, and they began the formal tour. The outer rings were impressive, but comprehensible. The Vokhari had built similar structures. Sorveth made appropriate sounds of admiration as Fenris explained the thermal cycling systems and the hydroponic bays and the modular HAB units that could be reconfigured within hours based on population needs. It was good engineering, honest and functional. Then Yiva led them inward. The corridors changed, the lighting shifted from warm white to something cooler, more focused. The walls became denser. Sorveth could feel the change in acoustics, the way sound stopped traveling the same way. The crew members they passed in these corridors moved with a different kind of purpose, less administrative, more concentrated. They stopped at a sealed bulkhead. Yiva placed her hand on a panel, and after a 3-second delay that Sorveth recognized as a deliberate security delay, not biometric reading time, but thinking time, the door opened. The chamber beyond was called the Helix Chamber. Sorveth would later struggle to describe it accurately in his reports to the Conclave. The chamber was spherical, perhaps 40 meters across. At its center, suspended in a magnetic containment field, was something that looked, at first, like a knot. A 3-dimensional knot of light and force, rotating slowly, its surface shifting through colors that Sorveth's eyes weren't entirely sure they were processing correctly. "What is this?" he asked. Petrov spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet and unhurried. "We call it the fold engine. It's the reason this station exists." Sorveth looked at the old man. "What does it do?" Petrov said, "It takes the gravitational output of Castor 9 and converts it directly into stored space-time curvature. Think of it like winding a spring, except the spring is a bubble of local physics, and when you release it, things on the inside of the bubble don't experience time the same way as things on the outside." Sorveth's translator took a moment longer than usual to process that. "You're describing temporal dilation," he said slowly. "Controlled temporal dilation." "On a small scale, so far," Yiva said. Sorveth stared at the fold engine. He thought about what the Conclave's best physicists believed about temporal mechanics. He thought about how many centuries of theoretical groundwork underpinned their understanding of what was and wasn't possible. He thought about the 17 distinct construction phases he'd noted in the station's structure, each one a correction, an improvement, a lesson learned and immediately applied. The Vocari had studied temporal mechanics for 4,000 years and concluded that controlled dilation was theoretically achievable but practically beyond reach for at least another 2 millennia. Humanity had been in space for 4 years. "How?" he asked, and the word came out smaller than he intended. Lyra Tash looked up from her tablet for the first time. She had the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this question. "We cheated," she said simply. Fenris elaborated. "Every theoretical framework on temporal mechanics assumed you needed to generate the curvature yourself. We didn't generate it, we borrowed it. Castor 9 is already doing the work. It's been doing it for 4 billion years. We just built a system to collect what it was already making and put it somewhere useful." "No one thought of that before," Sorveth said. "It wasn't a question." "Apparently not," Yiva said. There was no arrogance in her voice. If anything, she sounded slightly puzzled by the fact herself, as if she still wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. Sorveth turned back to the fold engine. The knot of light rotated. Somewhere in its depths, time itself was wound like a spring, patient and loaded. He thought again about the word drevaal, temporary, already gone. He thought about 37 dead civilizations. Then he thought about how all 37 had been assessed, catalogued, and gently dismissed by a conclave that had seen everything, and how not one of those civilizations had ever stood in front of an assembly observer and said, calmly, without pride or performance, "We cheated." That night, alone in his quarters aboard the measured step, Sorveth sent a message to the High Conclave. It was only 2 sentences long. "Our initial assessment of this species requires urgent revision. I believe we have made a significant error." The weight of old eyes. The High Conclave of the Galactic Assembly met in a place called the Chamber of Accord on a world so old its star had cooled from yellow to pale orange over the millennia of the Assembly's existence. 16 species, 11,000 years of shared history, and now a message from a diplomat who had never in 60 years of service sent anything described as urgent. They listened to Sorveth's full report in silence. It took 3 hours to deliver. When it was finished, the chamber stayed quiet for a long time, which among the Vocari was a sign of respect, and among several other species in the room was a sign of unease. The eldest member of the conclave was a being called Thurvan Oas, the representative of the Pelhari, a species so ancient they communicated primarily through bioluminescent patterns in their skin. Thurvan's skin had been mostly dark for decades, the sign of a being conserving thought. Now it flickered. The Pelhari interpreter translated. He asks whether the human device functions as described or if the diplomat has been deceived. The physics confirm it. I had our own engineers run the numbers 6 times. The fold engine is real, it is functioning, and it is, by any measure we possess, approximately 1,800 years ahead of where we believed humanity could be. More silence. A representative from the graph, squat armored beings who communicated in subsonic vibrations, asked through their own translator, "How is this possible? Their civilization is decades old by spacefaring standards. Their biology is fragile. They have no natural advantages, no extended lifespan, no collective cognition, no enhanced sensory processing. How does a species with every disadvantage produce a breakthrough that the full resources of the Assembly have not?" Sorveth had spent 3 days on this question before the conclave session. He had gone back through 60 years of human transmissions. He had watched archives of human history, the wars, the disasters, the collapses, the rebuildings. He had tried to find the pattern. He thought he had. "They don't think the way we think," he said slowly. "Every species in this chamber, when we encounter a barrier, we work to understand it completely before we attempt to overcome it. We build theoretical frameworks, we establish what is possible and what is not, and we work within those boundaries because the boundaries are correct. The boundaries exist for good reasons." "Yes," said the Grath representative, "that is called rigor. Humanity calls it something else. They call it a ceiling, and when they find a ceiling, their instinct, their cultural, almost biological instinct, is to look for a crack in it, not to break it from the front, not to wait until they understand it fully. They look for the one angle, the one assumption, the one variable that everyone agreed was fixed and wasn't, and they push there." He paused. "The fold engine works because a 26-year-old human engineer named Lyra Tash asked a question no Vocari physicist had ever asked, because no Vocari physicist would have considered it a serious question. She asked, what if we don't need to make the curvature ourselves? That's all. That one question taken seriously, applied practically, tested relentlessly, built in 17 iterations of failure and correction over 4 years, that's the fold engine." Thurvan Oas's skin flickered again. The interpreter listened. "He says they failed 17 times and continued." "Yes." "How do they tolerate failure so well?" Sorveth thought about the flowers on the graves. He thought about the rebuilt cities. He thought about the bear painted on the side of the Resolute. "I'm not sure they tolerate it. I think they absorb it.
Every failure becomes information. Every collapse becomes a blueprint for what not to do. They have a phrase, "This is how we learn." It's almost a cultural reflex. They say it about disasters, about wars, about experiments that kill people. Not with cruelty, with genuine grief indeed, but also with this absolute insistence that the loss must mean something, that something must be built from it. He looked around the chamber. 16 species, ancient, wise, and he was understanding this now with a clarity that felt like cold water, deeply, carefully protective of their own understanding of what was possible. We assessed them as drevaal because their biology is fragile, and their history is violent, and their civilization is young. We were looking at the right evidence and drawing the wrong conclusion. Their fragility isn't a weakness, it's the reason they move fast. They know they don't have forever. They know their bodies will fail, their civilizations can fall, their window might close. So they sprint, and they cheat, and they fail, and they get up, and they sprint again. Another silence. Then the Grath representative asked what everyone in the chamber had been carefully not asking for the past hour. What do they want from us? Sorveth almost smiled. Almost. That's what surprised me most. I asked Commander Drossian directly in our last meeting before I departed. I asked what humanity hoped to gain from joining the Assembly. Trade access, I assumed. Technology exchange. Military alliance. And she thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "We want to meet everyone. We want to know what you've all tried and what didn't work, so we don't spend 1,000 years making the same mistakes you already made. And then we want to help, if you'll let us." Thurvan Oas's skin blazed suddenly, full white luminescence, a display so intense the other representatives turned toward him. The interpreter stood very still for a moment, listening. Then, quietly, "He says he has not heard an answer like that in 4,000 years. He says the last species to speak that way was the Pelhari when they first joined the Assembly. He says he thought he would never hear it again." The Chamber of Accord stayed quiet for a very long time after that. Not from unease, from something older and rarer. Hope.
The test they didn't know they were taking. Full membership in the Galactic Assembly was not given, it was earned, through a process the Assembly called the consideration, a word in Vocari that carried the weight of both judgment and study because the two had always been the same thing to them. No species had ever been told they were being considered. The observers simply watched. They asked questions that seemed diplomatic and noted the answers that were not. They created situations, not deceptions, never outright deceptions, but pressures, problems, stresses applied to a young civilization to see how it bent. The consideration had taken as little as 11 years for one species. It had taken 4 centuries for another. For humanity, it lasted 8 months. Not because the Assembly ran out of tests, because humanity, without knowing it, kept answering questions that were supposed to reach years. The first test was a resource dispute. The Assembly, through back channels so subtle that no human diplomat detected the manipulation, arranged for 2 of humanity's colony ships to be redirected toward the same uninhabited moon. Both carrying settlers, both with legitimate transit authority, neither aware of the other. It was the kind of situation that had triggered conflicts in 9 of the 37 extinct civilizations. The Assembly had notes. The human ships arrived at the moon within 6 hours of each other.
Commander Yeva Drassian, who happened to be coordinating deep space traffic at the time, noticed the conflict in the routing data. She flagged it immediately. Then she got both ship captains on a three-way channel, explained the situation plainly, and said, "We have 2 ships and 1 moon. What do you both actually need?" It turned out one colony needed mineral access and the other needed surface area. The moon had both in abundance. A joint settlement was proposed, approved, and under construction within a week. The assembly observers noted no escalation, direct communication, problem reframed from competition to collaboration without prompting. The second test was harder. A Vokhari trade vessel, crewed, though the crew had agreed to participate in the exercise, transmitted a distress signal from the edge of human-explored space. The signal was genuine in format, but the nature of the emergency was constructed, a believable but manageable reactor fluctuation that would appear, to a young spacefaring species with not much experience, potentially catastrophic. The question being asked was simple: would humanity help, at cost to themselves, with no guaranteed benefit, for beings they had met only months ago? The Resolute was the nearest vessel. Yeva didn't hesitate. She diverted from her survey mission, burning extra fuel, and made the crossing in 14 hours. When she arrived, Fenris and his engineering team were aboard the Vokhari vessel within the hour. What happened next was not part of the test. Fenris, while working on the reactor systems, discovered something the Vokhari crew had not noticed, a secondary fault in the cooling architecture that was real, unrelated to the constructed emergency, and would have become catastrophic within approximately 90 hours. He fixed it without being asked. He didn't mention it dramatically. He finished his work, made a brief note in the repair log, and returned to the Resolute. The Vokhari crew chief found a notation 3 hours later. He stood in the engine room looking at the repair, elegant, minimal, effective, for a very long time. Then he filed a supplementary report to the assembly that said, "The human engineer repaired a fault we did not know existed. He did not mention it to our command crew. He did not request recognition. He simply fixed it because it needed to be fixed." The third test was the one that mattered most. The assembly told humanity, through Sorveth, officially in full diplomatic session, that another species had filed a territorial claim on a system humanity had been surveying. The species was called the drevaal, and unlike most of the gentle pressures the assembly had been applying, the drevaal's claim was real, and they were not friendly. The drevaal were among the assembly's oldest problems, not hostile enough to be expelled, not cooperative enough to be trusted. They pushed boundaries constantly, filed claims on systems they couldn't use, and retreated behind procedural arguments when challenged. They had learned the assembly's rules better than almost anyone and used them the way a lockpick uses a keyhole. They expected humanity to threaten or plead or go silent. But Lyra Tash, who by this point had taken a role in the diplomatic team because no one had told her she shouldn't, spent 3 days reading 11,000 years of assembly legal precedent, every ruling, every decision, every exception ever granted. On the 4th day, she submitted a 40-page document demonstrating that the drevaal's claim was invalid, not because of territorial law, but because of an environmental protection statute the drevaal themselves had helped write 600 years ago, designed to prevent development of systems with prebiotic chemistry. The system in question had that, exactly. The drevaal had claimed it knowing this, betting no one would cross-reference that far back. Lyra had cross-referenced that far back. The drevaal withdrew the claim within a week. They filed no counter-argument because there was no counter-argument. In 11,000 years of assembly legal history, no one had ever beaten them with their own legislation. When Sorveth reported this to the conclave, Thurvan Oss's skin flickered for a long time. The interpreter finally said, "He wants to know how old she is." Sorveth checked his records. 29. More flickering. "He says, keep watching. He says he thinks we have not seen anything yet."
The assembly had a monument on the old Orange Star world. Not a building, exactly. More of a garden, though that word didn't capture it well either. It was a place where the member species had planted things from their home worlds, each one chosen to survive on foreign soil, each one a quiet statement about what endurance looked like. The Vocari had planted a tree that grew 1 centimeter per year and lived for 10,000. The Grath had laid stones from their home ocean floor in careful patterns that meant, roughly, we were here. The Pelhari had done something that looked like nothing, a patch of seemingly bare ground, but under spectral analysis showed a dense network of chemically active root structures invisible to most eyes, spreading silently in all directions. When humanity was invited to contribute, the assembly expected something bold, something loud, a flag, perhaps, or a towering structure, or some demonstration of the engineering capability they'd already shown. What arrived was a small wooden box, transported personally by Commander Yeva Drossian. Inside were seeds, hundreds of them, dozens of species, sealed in individual packets with handwritten labels in at least 6 human languages. Wheat, olive, oak, amaranth, taro, apple, strangler fig, sunflower. At the bottom of the box, a single card, handwritten, that Sorveth translated carefully. It read, "Every one of these was almost lost. Disease, war, neglect, change in climate. Someone, somewhere, chose to carry these forward. We don't always know their names. We just know that because they chose to carry something, we still have it. We're planting these here because we think this place will last. We trust you to remember what it cost to keep them." Sorveth read the card twice. Then he took it to Thurvan Oss because he didn't trust his own translation to carry the full weight of it. The old Pelhari was quiet for a very long time. Then his skin showed something that the interpreters said they had no precise word for, a pattern that meant something between grief and recognition, and the feeling of finding something you thought was gone. The seeds were planted. That same week, the conclave voted unanimously to accelerate the consideration. Not to end it, the process had rules that even urgency couldn't entirely suspend, but to compress the remaining stages, to move faster, because something in the room had shifted, quietly, without announcement, the way important things often shift. The assembly had spent 11,000 years watching species arrive and fail. The pattern was so consistent that it stopped being sad and started being simply true, the way a geological fact is true, not cruel, just real. Species arrived fragile. Space was not fragile. The math was not complicated. Humanity was doing something to that pattern that the assembly didn't have a word for yet. Not breaking it, not proving it wrong, something more subtle. They were making the pattern wonder about itself. Yeva noticed the shift. She was observant in the way that people who have survived difficult things become observant, not paranoid, but tuned. She noticed that the Vocari staff who'd been formally polite were now pausing in corridors to ask her questions that weren't on any agenda. She noticed that the Grath delegate had sent Fenris a message requesting a technical consultation, unusual since the Grath rarely acknowledged that other species could teach them anything.
She pulled Petrov aside one evening in Meridian Station's small observation lounge, where the violet light of Castor 9 came through the viewport like a slow fire. "What's happening?" she asked. Petrov sat with his hands wrapped around a cup of something hot, looking out at Castor 9. "We're passing," he said. "Passing what?" "Whatever they needed us to pass." He took a slow drink. "I've been watching the Conclave's communication patterns for months. There's been a change." "What kind of change?" "They've stopped talking about us as a problem to assess. They've started talking about us as a problem they wish they had had before." Yeva looked at him. "What does that mean?" Petrov turned from the viewport. His eyes were the kind of tired that came from carrying something for a long time. "The assembly is old, Yeva. 11,000 years of the same species, the same histories, the same long, careful thoughts. They're wise, genuinely, but they've also spent so long watching things fail that some part of them stopped believing things could go another way." He looked back at Castor 9. "We're reminding them what it looks like to not know yet that something is impossible." She sat with that for a moment. "Is that enough?" she asked. "To remind people of something?" Petrov almost smiled. "Ask anyone who's ever carried a seed across a century."
The night the assembly argued about humanity. The debate that broke out in the Chamber of Accord in the 7th month was the longest in 400 years. It started, as many real arguments do, with something small. The drevaal, still stinging from Lyra Tasha's legal demolition, submitted a formal objection to the acceleration of humanity's consideration. Their stated argument was procedural. The rules existed for a reason, the timeline was established for a reason, no exception should be made regardless of circumstance. Their actual argument was obvious to everyone in the room, which made it more insulting, not less. But the drevaal had allies, not many, but some. Two other species, the Korathi and the Ven Selar, had their own concerns, less cynical but no less real. The Korathi raised the question of stability. Humanity was young, its political structures were still consolidating, its internal disagreements were many and sometimes violent. What if they were admitted and then fractured? What if the assembly welcomed them and 3 generations later humanity fell into internal war? The assembly had seen this before, twice, and both times it had cost the community deeply. The Ven Selar raised a quieter concern. They were a species that communicated in questions rather than statements. Their entire language was interrogative. Their representative spoke for 2 hours, and every sentence ended with a rising tone. But the core of what they were asking was something that several other members had been quietly thinking. What if humanity's speed is the problem? What if they move so fast that they break things the rest of us depend on? What if the fold engine is only the beginning of a pattern of changes we cannot predict? What if being remarkable is not the same as being safe? It was Sorveth who answered them, and not because it was his role to do. It was because he was the only one in the chamber who stood in the helix chamber and watched Commander Yeva Drosian look at a device that could bend time and ask the engineers whether it was properly shielded before she asked what it could do. He stood up, which was unusual. Vokhari conducted most formal proceedings seated. "I have spent 60 years studying this species," he said. "I was sent to confirm what we already believed, that they were interesting but fragile, that they would impress us briefly and then join the 37. I went to Meridian Station ready to write that report." He paused.
Instead, I watched a young engineer fix a problem she hadn't been asked to fix, because it needed fixing. I watched a commander divert resources to help strangers before she checked whether it was strategically advantageous. I watched a woman who had never studied galactic law read 11,000 years of it in 4 days because she thought there had to be a better answer somewhere, and she was right. He looked at the Venselar representative. You ask if being remarkable is the same as being safe. I ask you to consider, in 11,000 years, have we ever found that remarkable and careful were opposites? Or have we found that the most remarkable things, the Pelhari root network, the Grath stone calendar, the Vocari long tree, are remarkable precisely because someone chose to be careful with them, because someone understood that a thing worth building was worth protecting? The Venselar was quiet. Humanity carries seeds across light years, not weapons, seeds, things they almost lost, things someone chose to preserve and carry forward. They have a word for this. I looked it up. The word is legacy. And the weight they give it, the weight they place on what they leave behind, what they protect, what they refuse to let be forgotten, that is the weight of a species that moves without care. He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then Thurvan Oss, his skin blazed white. The interpreter stood up slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Not softer, but more careful, the way someone speaks when they are sure that the words they are carrying must arrive whole. He says, the Pelhari have sat in this chamber 11,000 years. They have watched species arrive and fail, and be mourned and forgotten. He says there have been 3 times in 11,000 years when a species arrived in this room and he felt what he felt now. He says both of the others are gone. He says he does not intend to vote against the third. The Karafi called for a full vote. The final count was 14-2. The 2 were the Dreveen and 1 Karafi faction that abstained on procedural grounds and was not actually opposed. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Assembly in the 8th month of the consideration, the shortest in Assembly history by a margin of 11 years. No one who voted felt they had moved too fast.
What they remember. The admission ceremony was held in the garden on the old Orange Star world, next to the monument where every member species had planted something from home. The human seeds had been in the ground for 3 months. Against all reasonable expectation, the soil composition was wrong, the light spectrum was different, the seasons didn't match what any of them were designed for. Several of them had germinated. Not all, a few, but some. The Assembly's botanist, a Vocari scientist who had spent 40 years studying off-world plant adaptation, filed a report about it that ran to 11 pages and concluded, with an honesty that Sorveth found quietly moving, that she wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. The seeds had simply decided, apparently, that this was where they were growing now and had adjusted accordingly. She noted in her conclusion that the strangler fig was doing particularly well. The ceremony was simple by the Assembly standards. The species representatives gathered in the garden in the soft orange light. Sorveth stood near the back, as was appropriate for a diplomat whose moment had passed, watching. Yeva Drossian stood at the center of the gathering with Fenris and Lyra and Petrov and several others from the Resolute, still in their slightly irregular uniforms, still carrying themselves with that particular human combination of confidence and obvious awareness that they were somewhere overwhelming. Thurvan Oss welcomed them in the Pelhari way, a sustained full-body luminescence that lasted 30 seconds, the equivalent of a speech in his species' terms. Sorveth watched human faces trying to absorb the strangeness and beauty of it all, and he watched them succeed, mostly because they were trying. Then the Assembly's eldest interpreter asked if humanity wished to make a statement. Yeva looked at her team. Something passed between them, some communication so familiar it didn't need words. She stepped forward. She didn't have a prepared speech. Sorveth later asked her about this, and she said she'd written one but left it aboard the Resolute because it started to feel wrong, like wearing someone else's clothes. What she said instead was this: "We know we got here fast, probably too fast by most measures. We made a lot of mistakes along the way, and we'll make more. We're aware of that." She looked around the garden, at the alien plants and alien stones and the barely visible spread of the Pelhari root network under the soil. "We've been reading about the Assembly, all the history we could access, the things that worked and the things that didn't, the species that are still here and the ones that aren't." She paused. "We came out here because we couldn't stay still. That's just true about us. We're restless. We don't do well with ceilings." A small sound moved through the human delegation. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, but something in between. "We also came out here because we understand, maybe more than any young species should, that doing something alone is slower and harder and more dangerous than doing it together. We've had to learn that lesson a few times back home, usually the hard way." She looked at Sorveth briefly. He held her gaze. "We're not here to change the Assembly. We're here to be part of it, to learn what you know, to carry what you've built. And if at some point we can see a crack in a ceiling that's been there too long, well," she shrugged, with the careful casualness of someone who wasn't being casual at all, "we'll mention it." The orange light shifted. Somewhere in the garden, a human sunflower, improbable, ungainly, far too yellow for the light, had turned its face toward the pale star, the way sunflowers do, the way they have done since long before humanity first looked up and started wondering what was out there. Thurvan Oast's skin moved through colors that the interpreters said they would need several hours to translate properly, but the first part was simple. It meant welcome. And the second part, the longer part, the 4,000-year-old part, the part that a being carries for a very long time before they finally find somewhere to put it, meant something like, "We had almost stopped believing you would come." Sorveth stood in the garden among the plants that should not have survived but had, and he thought about the word drevaal, which he had used so confidently for so long. He thought about the 37 species who fit the pattern. He thought about a 29-year-old woman with a data tablet reading 11,000 laws in 4 days because she believed the answer was there somewhere. He thought about a box of seeds and a handwritten card and the deliberate, almost stubborn faith that this place would last. He thought about how a species could be fragile and ancient at the same time. Fragile in body, ancient in grief and memory, and the hard-won understanding that nothing worth having survives by accident, that someone always has to choose to carry it forward. He removed the word drevaal from his professional vocabulary that day. He would not use it again. Not because the pattern it described was wrong, but because humanity reminded him, gently, relentlessly, without ever intending to, that patterns only hold until someone decides not to fit one. And if there was one thing Sorveth Khan had learned in 8 months of watching humanity move through the galaxy like a warm light through a very old and careful dark, it was this: tell a human something is impossible, and you have not ended the conversation. You have just begun it.
37 civilizations came before us, 37 species, looked out at the dark, reached toward it, and was swallowed by it. The galaxy had seen enough to stop expecting anything different. And then we arrived, not with perfect ships, not with ancient wisdom or biological advantage. We arrived patched together, restless, carrying seeds we almost lost, and the stubborn insistence that the answer had to be somewhere. We just hadn't looked in the right place yet. The galaxy called us temporary. We called it a ceiling. That is the oldest human truth there is. Not that we are the strongest, or the fastest, or the most prepared, but that we refuse, at a level so deep it borders on instinct, to accept that the conversation is over. Here is the question worth sitting with. If the greatest thing humanity ever brought to the stars was not a weapon, not a fleet, not a technology, but simply the refusal to stop asking what if, what does that say about what we owe each other down here, right now? If this story stayed with you, leave a like. It is the simplest way to carry something forward. Subscribe if you want to be here for what comes next. There are more stories where this one came from, and some of them are darker, and some are stranger, and all of them are about what we are capable of when the universe underestimates us. And if you want to see what happens when humanity takes its seat at that table, when the assembly learns just how right Farvano S was,